The morning rush at Juniper Glass Café was loud, warm, and completely ordinary right up until the sound of a hand striking a woman's face cut through every conversation in the room. Adrian Vale didn't yell. He didn't need to. The CEO of Vale Harbor Development had a way of making silence feel like a threat, and when the coffee hit his jacket, dark roast still steaming, he turned toward the nearest person holding a cup and made a decision in under 2 seconds. That person was Serena Dorsey. She tried to explain. He didn't listen. And in front of a cafe full of people, in front of her 9-year-old daughter, Adrian Vale, slapped her across the face like the truth of what happened didn't matter at all. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But Damon Greer, Adrian's personal bodyguard, a man who had spent 12 years making sure nothing rattled him, went completely still. Not because of the slap, because of what he saw when Serena bent down to pick up her scattered files and her sleeve slid up her wrist. A scar, crescent-shaped, thin and pale and unmistakable. His hands started shaking. If you're the kind of person who believes that quiet people sometimes carry the loudest stories, this channel is for you. Hit subscribe and stay with us. This one's worth hearing all the way through. Serena Dorsey was not the kind of woman who took up space. Not by choice, she had simply learned over 35 years of living that the world rarely made room for women who looked like her and lived like her, so she had gotten very good at moving through it quietly. She kept her head down, her work clean, and her opinions to herself, unless someone in her community needed her to speak up. Then she didn't stop. She lived with her 9-year-old daughter Mara in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building in South Larkin, a working-class neighborhood in West Philadelphia, where the corner stores still knew your name, and the landlords were increasingly owned by people who didn't. The apartment was small and drafty in winter, but Mara had covered the walls with her drawings, street scenes, portraits of neighbors, birds she had never seen in person but had looked up in library books and that made it feel like something worth holding on to. Serena worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a laundromat 3 blocks away. What she didn't advertise was that most of her evenings went into running Second Door, a volunteer-based organization she had built quietly over 6 years. No office, no website worth mentioning, just a network of people who knew that if a family got an eviction notice they couldn't understand, or a worker got injured and didn't know their rights, or a single mother needed emergency help and had nowhere to turn, they could call Serena. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she remembered what it felt like to have no one call back. The morning everything changed, she had come to Juniper Glass Café to meet a community attorney named Bridget Cole, who had agreed to review a stack of eviction notices Serena had collected from South Larkin residents over the past 3 weeks. The notices had problems, wrong dates, missing signatures, citation codes that didn't match current housing law. Serena had organized them into a folder, color-coded with a handwritten summary on top. Mara's school had sent a last-minute message about an early dismissal, so the girl sat in the corner booth with a sketch pad and a hot chocolate drawing quietly while her mother waited. Adrian Vale arrived at the same cafe 20 minutes later, flanked by 2 men in dark jackets, his phone already in his hand before he reached the door. He was 41, sharp-featured, and wore the particular expression of someone who had spent so long being deferred to that he had forgotten it was a social arrangement rather than a natural law. Vale Harbor Development, the company he ran, had been his father's before it was his, a real estate empire that had built its early reputation on mid-market housing and its current one on luxury redevelopment. The South Larkin project was the largest acquisition in the company's history. Dozens of residential blocks cleared and rebuilt as high-end condominiums. The numbers were extraordinary. The details of who currently lived there were not something Adrian spent much time on. Walking 2 steps behind him as always was Damon Greer. Damon was 44, broad-shouldered, and had the careful stillness of a man trained to notice everything while showing nothing. He had worked in search and rescue for 8 years before a back injury ended that career, and had spent the 6 years since working private security. The Vale Harbor contract was his best-paying job by a significant margin. It had to be his mother had been in a long-term care facility for 3 years, and the monthly bills were the kind of number that made other financial concerns feel abstract. He was good at his job. He was professional, dependable, and he did not ask questions about the business decisions of the man he protected. He kept his right hand gloved always, even in summer, even indoors. Also present that morning, already seated at a corner table near the window reviewing documents before the investors arrived, was Preston Rourke, Vale Harbor's legal counsel for 19 years. He was 62, silver-haired, and had the composed authority of a man who had spent 2 decades making problems disappear before they became visible. He glanced up when Adrian entered, nodded once, and returned to his papers. He was not a man who needed to perform his importance. He had long since arranged things so that his importance was simply assumed. Nobody at Juniper Glass Café that morning would have guessed that 2 of the people in that room, the quiet woman with the color-coded folder and the stone-faced bodyguard behind the CEO, had been in the same burning building 12 years ago. That one of them had saved the other's life. That the other had spent 12 years not knowing her name. They were about to find out. It happened fast, the way most irreversible things do. A young server named Tyler was cutting between tables with a tray moving too quickly in a room too crowded when his foot caught the leg of a chair and his arm swung out for balance. The coffee, a double Americano ordered black, still near boiling, left the cup in a clean arc and landed squarely on the left lapel of Adrian Vale's jacket. Tyler went pale. He started apologizing before the words were fully formed, reaching for the cloth on his arm, saying, "Sir, and I'm so sorry, and please let me in," rapid, overlapping fragments. Adrian didn't look at him. He looked at Serena. She was standing 2 feet away, waiting for her own order at the pickup counter, a paper cup in her hand. That was all. She was simply there, close, holding a cup, and Adrian Vale made the calculation that people like him often make without noticing they're making it. He picked the most convenient explanation and decided it was true. "You did that," he said. Serena looked up. "I didn't. The server." "I saw you." "Sir, I've been standing here. My cup is still full." She held it up, lid sealed, sleeve still dry. "Your server lost his balance. I'm sorry it happened, but it wasn't me." There was a moment, just a moment, where the room held its breath, and it could have gone another way. Where a man paying attention might have looked at the actual evidence in front of him and recalibrated. But Adrian Vale was not in that moment paying attention to evidence. He was paying attention to his ruined jacket, his waiting investors, and the fact that someone was standing in front of him calmly explaining why he was wrong. He slapped her. Open-handed, sharp, fast. The sound of it traveled to every corner of the cafe. A woman near the window gasped. Someone's chair scraped back. The barista behind the counter froze with a cup halfway to the machine. Serena's head turned with the impact. She didn't fall. She didn't make a sound. In the corner booth, Mara looked up from her sketch pad. The girl didn't cry. She didn't call out. She set her pencil down with the particular steadiness of a child who has learned to read a room, slid out of the booth, and walked to her mother's side. She didn't say anything. She just stood there close enough to press her shoulder against Serena's arm and looked at Adrian Vale with the kind of clear, unafraid attention that only children and people with nothing left to lose can manage. The cafe was completely silent. 2 people at a corner table had their phones up. Nobody stepped forward. Serena straightened slowly. She pressed 2 fingers to the corner of her mouth, checked them, and then looked at Adrian with an expression that was not anger, not yet, maybe not ever, but something steadier and more permanent than anger. The kind of look that meant she was already somewhere past this moment, already watching it from a distance, already understanding what it would cost him. "One day," she said quietly, "you'll be ashamed of this." She reached down and began gathering the files that had scattered when she stepped back from the impact. Her hands were steady. The folder had come open and pages had fanned across the floor, eviction notices, legal citations, handwritten notes, the careful evidence of months of quiet work. And that was when her sleeve slid up. And that was when Damon saw it. The scar was thin and pale curved like a crescent moon across the inside of her left wrist. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. Easy to dismiss if you didn't know what had made it. Damon knew. He had spent 12 years trying not to think about that night. Not because the memory was vague, it was the opposite. It was one of the clearest things he carried, preserved in the particular way that near-death experiences tend to be. Every detail sharp, every second accounted for. The smell of the smoke, and the sound of the ceiling giving way, and the specific weight of a hand gripping his forearm and pulling him upright when his legs had already decided to quit. He had never seen her face clearly. The smoke was too thick, the emergency lighting already gone. But he had seen her wrist when she reached for him. He had seen the torn fabric she wrapped around it afterward to stop the bleeding, the dark stains spreading fast, and the way she kept moving anyway, kept calling out to the others, kept working the jammed exit door with her shoulder like her own pain was a detail she would get to later. He had filed 2 reports in the weeks after the fire asking if anyone had identified the woman. Both went unanswered. He had eventually been told by a Vail Harbor liaison, professionally, efficiently, that all individuals present had been accounted for, and that no further follow-up was required. He had been 29 years old, grateful to be alive, and not yet the kind of man who knew how to push back against a corporate liaison. So he had let it go. He had never stopped seeing that scar when he closed his eyes, and now it was here, 3 feet in front of him, on the wrist of a woman who had just been struck across the face by the man Damon was paid to protect. He didn't move immediately. That was the part he would have the most trouble living with later. He stood still and ran the calculation that his life had trained him to run the contract. The monthly payment to the care facility, his mother's name on the intake form, the way the administrator had said, "We'll need next month's payment by the 15th, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered that message many times. He thought about what speaking up would cost him. He thought about whether he was even certain whether a scar was really enough, whether 12 years and bad lighting and a 3-second glimpse could be trusted. Serena stacked the last of her files and straightened up. She put her hand on Mara's shoulder and turned toward the door. Damon looked at Mara. The girl was looking back at him, not asking for anything, not afraid, just watching him the way she had watched everything else in the last 2 minutes, with complete, quiet attention, as if she was simply recording what kind of person he turned out to be. He thought, she's going to remember this. Whatever I do right now, she is going to remember it. Adrian was already turning back toward his table, already reaching for his phone, already reassembling the version of the morning in which this was a minor inconvenience on the way to a productive meeting. At the corner table, Preston Rourke had closed his documents folder and was watching the room with the composed expression of a man calculating how quickly this could be managed. Damon took off his right glove. He stepped forward and he moved to stand between Adrian and the door. Adrian. His voice came out lower than he intended, rough at the edges. Stop. Adrian turned, mildly annoyed. Damon. The woman you just hit. He had to stop and start again. His hands were not steady. I know her. I don't know her name. I never knew her name. But I know that scar. He looked at Serena, who had gone very still. 12 years ago. The Eastbridge Community Center fire. She was there. She's the one who got people out. He held up his right hand, the burn scar crossing his palm in a wide, uneven stripe, visible now for the first time in years. She pulled me out. I would have died in that building. His voice dropped to almost nothing. The woman you just slapped is the reason I'm standing here. The cafe, which had begun to exhale, went silent again. Across the room, Preston Rourke's pen stopped moving. The video was 47 seconds long. Someone had captured the whole thing. The spilled coffee, the exchange, the slap, Mara walking to her mother's side, Serena's quiet words, and Damon's confession at the end, and posted it before Serena had even left the building. By noon, it had 3 million views. By evening, the number was difficult to track because it had been reposted across too many platforms to count. The comments were not measured. The public was not interested in waiting for context. Adrian Vail's name was searchable in a way it had never been before, and not in the way his communications team had spent years carefully engineering. The stock dropped 4% by close of market. 2 of the 3 investment partners scheduled for the South Larkin meeting sent messages postponing indefinitely. The third didn't send a message at all, which Adrian's financial director told him was actually worse. The board convened an emergency call that evening, and the chairman used the phrase reputational containment 6 times in 40 minutes, which was 6 times more than Adrian had ever heard it used in his entire career. In the 40 minutes following Damon's statement in the cafe, Adrian had said nothing directly to him. He had looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that is not anger but something colder and more evaluative, and then turned and walked out. Damon understood without being told that the contract was finished. He sent a formal resignation by email that evening before Adrian could make it official. He received no reply. Adrian sat in his office after the board call and said nothing for a long time. He did not think he had done something wrong. That was the honest version of events, and Adrian Vale, whatever else he was, ran on honest internal accounting. He had reacted. The situation had been misread. He would have preferred it hadn't happened, but the core of what he felt was closer to inconvenience than remorse, and some part of him, a part he didn't examine too carefully, understood that this said something about him that the public had apparently already figured out. What moved him was not the outrage. It was the file his assistant placed on his desk at 7 that evening. He had asked for it himself, background on the East Bridge Community Center fire 12 years prior. The fire had occurred in a Vail Harbor-managed property. He had known that in the abstract, the way you know things about a company's history when you inherit it rather than build it. What he had not looked at directly were the details of the aftermath. The official report stated that all occupants had been evacuated safely through coordinated internal response. It described the process in calm, bureaucratic language that made it sound orderly and managed. It credited the building's security staff. It noted that no fatalities had occurred. It did not mention a single civilian. It did not mention a woman. It did not mention anyone breaking a locked emergency exit with a piece of scrap metal while 8 months pregnant. And at the bottom of the report, under reviewed and certified by, was a signature Adrian recognized immediately. Preston Rourke. He read it twice. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling. Preston had been with Vail Harbor for 19 years, the company's legal backbone, through 3 ownership transitions, 2 federal audits, and 1 discrimination lawsuit settled quietly before discovery. He was methodical, loyal, and completely indispensable, and Adrian had never once had reason to question his judgment. He pulled the building management records next, the emergency exit maintenance logs. And there, in a chain of internal communications that had never been flagged because no one had ever looked for them, was a work order issued 14 days before the fire. A directive to secure the East Corridor emergency exits with chain locks during overnight hours. Reason given, unauthorized occupant access liability concern. The order had been approved by the building manager, copied to legal. Preston Rourke's initials were in the CC line. Adrian closed the file. He opened it again. He thought about Serena Dorsey standing in that cafe holding her own sealed cup, explaining calmly that she had not done anything, and the way he had not listened for even 1 full second before deciding she was wrong. He picked up his phone and called Damon. "I know you resigned," he said. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking you to find her. Don't tell her it's from me." Damon found her on the 3rd attempt. The first time he went to her apartment building in South Larkin, a neighbor told him Serena wasn't taking visitors. The second time he waited outside the laundromat where she worked, and she walked past him without slowing down. Eyes forward. The particular blindness of a woman who had learned that ignoring a problem long enough sometimes made it leave. The third time he sat on the front steps of her building at 7 in the morning with 2 coffees and didn't move for an hour and a half. She came out at 8:30, saw him and stopped. "I'm not interested in whatever Vail Harbor is offering," she said. "I'm not here for Vail Harbor. I resigned the night of the cafe." He held out one of the coffees. "I'm here because I owe you something I've been carrying for 12 years, and I'd like to put it down." She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. She took the cup. They sat on the steps and Damon talked first. He told her about the night of the East Bridge fire where he had been, what he remembered the exact sequence of it. The smoke, the locked door, the ceiling section that came down and caught his left leg. the panic that had started replacing oxygen as the thing filling his lungs. He described the voice, low and steady, saying, "Stay with me, I've got you," and the grip on his arm that felt unreasonably strong for how small the hand was. He told her about the 2 reports he had filed and the dead ends they led to, and the Vail Harbor liaison who had told him everyone was accounted for and that no further follow-up was required. Then he said, "I saw your scar in the cafe and I didn't speak up immediately. I want you to know that. I want you to know exactly what almost stopped me, because you deserve the honest version." Serena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me." He told her about his mother, the care facility, the contract with Adrian, the calculation he had run while she was walking toward the door with Mara. "And then your daughter looked at me," he said. "And I just couldn't." Serena nodded slowly. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. For a long time she said nothing, and Damon had the sense she was deciding not whether to trust him, but whether to spend the energy that telling the truth would require. Then she spoke. She had been 23 and 7 months pregnant when the Eastbridge fire started. She was working a temporary administrative job at the community center, covering a maternity leave that had run long. She had been the last person in the East Corridor when the smoke alarm went off, and when she reached the emergency exit, she found it secured with a heavy chain and a padlock. She had not panicked. She told Damon this matter-of-factly, not as a boast. She had simply looked at the door, looked at the chain, and gone to find something that could break it. A metal pipe from a utility closet. 3 strikes to the padlock. The chain came loose on the 4th. She had gone back in twice. Once for a group of elderly residents who hadn't heard the alarm, once for Damon. The cut happened when the exit door began swinging shut from the pressure differential, and she forced her arm into the gap to hold it open. The heated edge of the door frame caught her wrist. "I tried to report it afterward," she said. "I called the building management number 3 days later. It was disconnected. I called the city's emergency response office, and someone took my name and said they'd follow up." A pause. "Mara was born 5 weeks after that, 6 weeks after the fire. Nobody ever called." She looked at the scar on her wrist the way you look at something so familiar it has almost stopped being visible. "I didn't carry it as a wound," she said. "I carried it as a reminder that I did what I was supposed to do. That was enough for me." She glanced at him. "What I need now isn't recognition. I need Vail Harbor to stop pushing families out of South Larkin with illegal notices. I need the Eastbridge record corrected with the real names of the people who were there. And I need Second Door to stay independent, not become a charity project some corporation puts its logo on to look good after a scandal." Damon nodded. "Those are 3 very specific things. I've had 12 years to think about it." He looked at her for a moment. "Bridget Cole, the attorney you were supposed to meet that morning, have you been in contact with her?" "She reached out after everything went public," Serena said. "She's still willing to help. We've been working through the eviction notices together." She paused. "She's careful, but she's not scared." "Good," Damon said. "You're going to need that." Preston Rourke moved quickly the way he always had. Within 48 hours of the Café incident, he had assembled a counter-narrative clean enough to present to the board and simple enough to land with the press. Serena Dorsey was a struggling single mother facing eviction, financially desperate, who had seized on a bodyguard's emotional reaction to manufacture a connection to a 12-year-old fire. The scar could have come from anywhere. The timing, her appearance in a cafe where Adrian Vail happened to be meeting investors, carrying files related to a Vail Harbor project, was either remarkable coincidence or deliberate positioning. Preston didn't say which. He simply laid the 2 options side by side and let people draw conclusions. He had done this before. He was very good at it. The tabloids picked up the angle first. A legal blog published an analysis suggesting that even if Serena's account of Eastbridge were true, the statute of limitations on any civil claim had long since expired. A conservative news aggregator ran a piece questioning whether Damon Greer, described as emotionally compromised by a past trauma, was a reliable witness to anything. None of it was loud. All of it was effective. Serena felt the shift within days. The chatter around her changed texture. Less outright support, more hesitation. the particular silence of people who had been publicly behind her and were now quietly recalculating their exposure. The laundromat owner called her on a Tuesday morning, apologetic and indirect, and told her it would be better for everyone if she took some time away from her shifts until things settled down. She understood what things settling down meant. She thanked him and hung up. Two of the South Larkin families who had given her their eviction notices asked to have them back. Not because they didn't believe her, they said that carefully more than once, but because a Vail Harbor representative had contacted them individually to discuss an updated relocation package, and they couldn't afford to jeopardize it. One woman, a grandmother of 4 who had lived in her apartment for 22 years, told Serena through the cracked door, "I believe you, hun. I just can't fight with you right now." Serena told her she understood. She did. The evening that hit hardest started ordinarily. Serena was making dinner, Mara at the kitchen table doing homework, the small sounds of their routine filling the apartment. Then Mara set down her pencil and asked without looking up from her worksheet, "Mom, are we going to have to move?" Serena turned from the stove. "What made you think about that?" "Lily said her mom said our building is going to get knocked down. And at school today, some kids were saying you were lying about the fire." A pause. "I told them you don't lie, but they kept saying it." Serena crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her daughter. She waited until Mara looked up. "What do you think?" Serena asked. Mara considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I think you don't lie," she said. "And I think those kids were repeating what their parents said, and their parents were repeating what they saw on their phones. That's not the same as knowing." Serena looked at her daughter for a long moment. "No," she said, "it's not." She went back to the stove and did not let Mara see her face. That night, after the girl was asleep, Serena sat at the kitchen table with the folder of eviction notices and looked at the walls covered in Mara's drawings. She thought about the East Bridge exit door and the weight of it against her arm and the choice she had made to hold it open. She had not hesitated then. She had been 23, pregnant, and completely alone in a smoke-filled hallway, and she had not hesitated. She allowed herself alone in the kitchen at 11 at night to feel exactly how tired she was. She thought that was fair, that you were allowed to be tired and still not stop. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Damon found the footage on a Thursday. He had spent 6 days working backward through the East Bridge paper trail, not through Vail Harbor's records, but through the city's public archive system, municipal fire investigation filings, and a retired community center administrator named Gerald Marsh, who had kept personal copies of everything because, as he told Damon over the phone, "I never trusted the way that report came out." Gerald had a VHS tape. Security camera footage from the East Corridor recorded the night of the fire on a system so outdated it hadn't been included in the digital evidence request Vail Harbor's lawyers had submitted in the weeks after the incident. It had sat in a cardboard box in Gerald's basement for 12 years, labeled in marker EC Fire Raw, unreviewed. Damon drove to Gerald's house that evening and watched it on a television set that took 2 minutes to warm up. The footage was grainy. The timestamp burned into the lower right corner in blocky orange numbers. But it was clear enough. A young woman in a center staff shirt, visibly pregnant, crossing the East Corridor at a run. The locked exit door. Her returning with a length of pipe. The strikes against the padlock. People moving through the door behind her while she held it open with her body braced against the frame. Then a man Damon recognized himself at 29 with a strange doubling sensation, stumbling from a side corridor going down. The woman going back in, coming out with him. The timestamp ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Damon transferred the tape to a secure digital format that same evening and saved 2 copies, one on an encrypted personal drive, one sent directly to Bridget Cole's secure legal inbox with a message, "Don't open this on an unsecured network. Don't tell anyone you have it until we talk." He drove home feeling for the first time in weeks that the ground under this situation was solid. He was 2 blocks from his apartment when his phone rang. It was Gerald. The storage unit had been broken into. The original tape was gone. Gerald's personal copy had been removed from his living room bookshelf sometime in the previous 3 hours. His front door showed no sign of forced entry. Whoever had come in had known the lock code, which meant resources or inside access or both. Damon sat in his car and thought about the 2 digital copies he had already sent out before making that drive home. He said, "Gerald, I need you to stay somewhere else tonight. Do you have someone you can call?" The encrypted copy and Bridget Cole's copy were intact. Preston had moved fast, but not fast enough. What Preston did next was more precise. He couldn't retrieve the digital files, so he targeted the people carrying them. Bridget Cole received a phone call at 6 the following morning from a man who did not identify himself, but mentioned in unhurried detail her home address, her daughter's school schedule, and the phrase, "Some cases aren't worth finishing." She called Serena at 7, her voice controlled but her breathing uneven, and told her she was sorry, and that she had a family, and that she hoped Serena understood. Serena told her she understood completely. She meant it. She called Damon immediately after. "She's out," she said. "The footage!" "I have it," he said. "Bridget forwarded her copy to me before she withdrew. We still have it." A pause. "We need a new attorney, fast." Marcus Webb called that afternoon. He was 29, a public interest lawyer who had read every document Serena had filed and contacted her through Second Door's volunteer network. He told her he had seen the footage, that he understood the risk, and that he wanted to help. He said, "I'm not going to be scared off." He said it simply without drama, in the way of someone who has already thought through what it means and decided. The emergency hearing had been scheduled for Friday, a judicial review of the South Larkin demolition order. Preston had maneuvered to keep it on the calendar, calculating that a quiet legal victory would do more to close the situation than any press statement. He planned to introduce a certified city record showing no civilian intervention at Eastbridge, a record filed 11 years ago by a Vail Harbor representative acting on behalf of the company's legal counsel. On Thursday evening, he placed a single-page document on Adrian's desk, a prepared public statement, 3 paragraphs. It described Serena's claims as unsubstantiated and committed Vail Harbor to continuing its South Larkin development in the interest of the city's growth. "Sign this tonight," Preston said. "By Monday, this is over." Adrian looked at the page. He looked at the Eastbridge maintenance order in his desk drawer. Preston's initials in the CC line dated 14 days before the fire. He did not pick up the pen. The hearing room was not large enough for everything it contained that Friday morning. It was a standard municipal chamber. Fluorescent lighting, folding chairs in uneven rows, a raised platform for the 3-person review panel, a smell of old coffee and recirculated air. It had hosted hundreds of routine hearings that nobody outside the room cared about. This one had a line of people waiting outside before the doors opened. Serena sat at the petitioner's table with Marcus Webb, who had spent the previous 48 hours reviewing every document she owned and had slept, by his own account, approximately 4 hours. He was composed in the way of someone running on conviction rather than comfort. Serena had decided to trust him. She didn't have a better option, and she had learned a long time ago that better options rarely arrived on schedule. Preston Rourke sat at the opposing table with a team of 3. He was composed in the particular way of a man who has already decided how a room will go. The panel chair called the session to order. Preston presented first a methodical, thoroughly documented case for why the South Larkin demolition order was procedurally sound and legally supported. He introduced the certified city record from the Eastbridge Emergency Management Archive. He stated clearly for the record that no evidence existed of civilian intervention during the Eastbridge evacuation, and that claims to the contrary had emerged suspiciously close in time to a public controversy involving Vail Harbor's CEO. He let the implications settle. Then he turned to Serena directly. "Ms. Dorsey," he said with the measured courtesy of a man who has already won, "if you were present at the Eastbridge fire and performed the actions you've described, why did you wait 12 years to say so?" The room went quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet in the cafe. This was the silence of people who had already half decided the answer and were waiting to see if she could change it. Serena looked at him steadily. When she spoke, her voice was even. "Because I was 23 years old, 7 months pregnant, and completely alone," she said. "Because the phone number I called was disconnected. Because the office I contacted took my name and never called back. Because 6 weeks later, I had a newborn daughter and no paid leave, and I needed to keep working to keep our apartment." She paused. "I didn't stay silent because I was hiding something. I stayed silent because nobody made it possible to be heard." I'd like the panel to understand that those are not the same thing. Something in the room changed temperature slightly. Preston recognized it the way an experienced navigator recognizes a change in wind. He moved to close his argument. That was when Marcus Webb called Damon Greer as a witness. Preston's team objected immediately. The panel chair considered for a moment, then allowed it. The hearing was investigative rather than adjudicative, and the panel retained discretion. Preston objected again. The chair said, "We'll hear him." Damon walked to the front of the room and placed his scarred right hand flat on the table in front of the panel. He told them about the night of the East Bridge fire in the same precise, undecorated way he had told Serena on her front steps. The smoke, the locked exit, the ceiling section, the voice, the hand, the wrist he had seen as she wrapped it with torn fabric, the crescent-shaped cut still bleeding while she kept working, kept going back in. "I filed 2 reports asking about her afterward," he said. "Both were closed without follow-up. I was told by a Vail Harbor liaison that everyone had been accounted for." He looked at Preston. "I was 29. I didn't know how to push back against that." He paused. "I know now," after Damon Marcus called 6 names from the public gallery. 6 people stood one by one and walked to the front of the room. An older man who had been a janitor at the center. A woman who had been attending an evening class. A teenager in 2013 who was now 26 with 2 kids of his own. They did not all speak well. Some were nervous. One woman cried before she finished her first sentence and had to stop and start again. Every single one of them described the same woman, the same door, the same voice. Then Marcus stood and said, "With the panel's permission, I'd like to read a brief written statement submitted by Serena Dorsey's daughter, Mara." Preston's team objected. The panel chair overruled them. Marcus read, "I didn't know my mom was a hero until someone else told me. But I knew she was the kind of person who gets up in the middle of the night to turn the light on when I'm scared. I think those are the same thing." The room was silent for several seconds. Then Adrian Vail stood up from the back row. He had come in quietly, without announcement, 10 minutes after the session started. Preston had seen him and said nothing, calculating that Adrian's presence was either a show of support or irrelevant. He had not considered the third option. Adrian walked to the front of the room and placed a manila folder on the panel's table. "My name is Adrian Vail," he said. "I'm the CEO of Vail Harbor Development. This folder contains internal company documents that I am submitting voluntarily to this panel and simultaneously to the city's office of the Inspector General." He kept his eyes on the panel and did not look at Preston. "These documents include a work order dated 14 days before the East Bridge fire, directing that emergency exits in the East Corridor be secured with chain locks. They include the internal communications chain approving that order. And they include the post-fire report certified by Vail Harbor's legal counsel that omitted all civilian involvement from the official record." He set a second sheet on top. "This is the name of the person whose initials appear on every one of those documents." The panel chair picked it up, read it, looked at the opposing table. Preston Rourke did not move, but something left his face in that moment, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet, irreversible way that certainty leaves a person when they finally understand that the door they spent years locking from the outside has just been opened from within. He looked for the first time in the proceedings like a man without a next move. The weeks that followed moved the way significant things tend to move slowly at first, then all at once. The panel issued an immediate stay on the South Larkin demolition order, pending a full procedural review. The Inspector General's office opened a formal investigation into the East Bridge post-fire report within 72 hours of receiving Adrian's documents. Preston Rourke was placed on administrative leave from Vail Harbor the following Monday, and retained private criminal defense counsel by Wednesday, which told most people what they needed to know about how he assessed his own situation. The chain of internal communications Adrian had submitted was not the only copy. Gerald Marsh had kept scanned duplicates of the original building management files on a hard drive that had been in his car, not his storage unit, the night of the break-in. He turned them over without being asked. The digital footage Damon had secured, the 4 minutes and 17 seconds from the East Corridor, was entered into the Inspector General's record and later described by the investigator's office as the single most consequential piece of evidence in establishing the timeline of events. Preston's attorneys argued its authenticity for 3 weeks before the lab analysis came back unambiguous. The Eastbridge Victims Fund was established 6 weeks later through a negotiated agreement between Vail Harbor's new interim legal team and a coalition of attorneys representing the survivors. It was not a large fund by the standards of corporate settlements. It was significant by the standards of the people it reached. Adrian stepped down as CEO while the investigation was ongoing. He said in a brief public statement that he was stepping aside because an independent investigation required independence, and that the events of the past several weeks had shown him things about his company and about himself that he intended to spend considerable time examining. It was the least performative thing he had said publicly in years. He did not contact Serena during this period. He had said what he needed to say at the hearing. He understood without being told that she did not need his presence in her life while she was rebuilding it. The amended Eastbridge emergency response record was processed 8 weeks after the hearing. It listed under civilian evacuation assistance, Serena Dorsey Community Center staff primary. It listed 6 others by name. It noted that the East Corridor emergency exit had been manually breached by civilian action after being found secured with a chain lock, and that this action was directly responsible for the safe evacuation of 23 individuals. Damon left a framed copy on Serena's doorstep without knocking. She found it in the morning. She stood in the doorway and read it once, then brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and made coffee, and looked at it while the coffee brewed. She did not cry. She had cried twice during the whole of it, once alone in the kitchen late at night, once in a parking lot after dropping Mara at school on a day when she wasn't sure what was going to happen. Both times, she had given herself exactly as long as she needed and then stopped. This felt different. This felt like something settling rather than something breaking. Juniper Glass Café reopened on a Saturday in early spring. The owner had closed it temporarily in the weeks after the video went viral, less from choice than from the practical reality that the room needed to become itself again rather than a location. When it reopened, the neighborhood showed up not dramatically, just in the ordinary way of a community that has decided to continue. The regulars came back. Some new people came who had heard about it and were curious. The corner booth where Mara had been sitting was occupied by a retired teacher working a crossword puzzle. Serena came in at mid-morning with Mara, who went immediately to a table near the window and opened her sketch pad. She was working on a series, now portraits of South Larkin residents, careful and detailed, each one labeled in her small print with the person's name and how long they had lived in the neighborhood. She had 17 so far. On the wall near the counter, the owner had hung a single framed photograph. Small, unposed, taken at the community gathering after the amended Eastbridge record was issued. 23 people standing outside a rec center in the late afternoon light. Some were looking at the camera, some were talking to each other. None of them were arranged. It looked exactly like what it was, a group of ordinary people who had been in the same place at the same time and had made it through. Serena was near the left edge of the photo, half-turned, saying something to the woman beside her. You would not pick her out as the most important person in the frame unless you already knew. She looked at it for a moment, then looked away. Mara was sketching without looking up. Then she said conversationally, "Mom, come look at this one." Serena crossed the cafe and leaned over her daughter's shoulder. The drawing was nearly finished. A woman sitting at a window table, a coffee cup in front of her, light coming in from the left. The posture was exact, straight-backed hands settled, not waiting for anything, simply present. "Is that me?" Serena asked. Mara considered the drawing critically. "It's going to be," she said. "I'm not done yet." Serena sat down beside her. She was still sitting there when Adrian came in 20 minutes later. No security, no team, no jacket that cost more than some people's monthly rent. He looked like a man in the early stages of learning how to occupy less space, and he was doing it imperfectly, which was probably the right way to start. He didn't approach her table. He went to the counter, ordered a coffee, and then walked over and placed a document folder on the edge of the table nearest to where she sat. "You don't have to look at it now," he said. "I just wanted you to have it." Serena looked at the folder but didn't open it. She knew what it was. "I'm not going to tell you it makes anything even," Adrian said. "I know it doesn't. I just needed it to exist in the right form with the right names on it, and for you to have a copy that came directly from me." He paused. "That's all I came to do." Serena looked at him for a moment, not warmly, not coldly. The way you look at something you have assessed clearly and are done being surprised by. "Okay," she said. He nodded once and walked to a table on the other side of the cafe. He sat and did not look over at her again. Mara had watched the whole exchange with her pencil hovering above the page. When Adrian sat down, she returned to her drawing without comment. After a moment, she said, still drawing, "Is he going to be okay?" "I don't know," Serena said honestly. Mara nodded as if this were a reasonable answer. "Are we?" Serena looked at her daughter. She looked at the drawing on the table, the figure at the window, not yet finished, light coming in from the left. She looked at the scar on her wrist, pale and curved and so familiar she almost never saw it anymore. "Yeah," she said. "We are." Mara went back to drawing. Outside, the neighborhood continued its morning, unhurried, unannounced, made of the 10,000 small, ordinary things that constitute a life worth protecting. This story is a reminder that the people who hold the door open, the ones who go back in, when everyone else is running out, rarely make it onto the official record. They just keep going. They raise their kids, they show up for their neighbors, and they carry their scars quietly. If this story stayed with you, it probably means you believe what Serena believed, that doing the right thing matters even when no one is watching, and that the truth, however long it takes, has a way of finding its way back to the surface. If that's the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and stay with us. Every story we tell is about someone the world almost overlooked. We think they're worth your time.